So just to get us started, I'd like to share a little bit about myself and why this idea of the fire that fuels is so important. So I began this work as a human rights and social justice activist, and as a young organizer, I experienced burnout. I was working on prison abolition work, and particularly youth incarceration, and every time I was talking to a family that had been separated, or talking to a youth behind bars, it made me want to try harder. It made me want to push. The more tired I was, the harder I pushed. And it's kind of like a grocery bag that you keep filling with more and more stories and more experiences until one day there's one more story and it breaks. And so I experienced burnout myself and didn't understand or know what was really happening. And it wasn't until I began working in the Burma movement for human rights and democracy, and working in that movement for many years, based in the region. My job was as an advocacy consultant to work alongside grassroots organizations and help them develop strategies to strengthen the movement. And there's a joke in Burma that there are 3 organizations for every 2 people. So there's one that they share and start together, and then the 2 that start when they split off. And the challenge with beginning to do advocacy strategy was that there was so much conflict and division. There were so many organizational stresses. There was so much trauma that people were experiencing in the movement that often we had to do that before we were even be able to build strategy together. And I realized that the same things that I was feeling, the stress and the drain, were impacting how our organizational cultures were created and formed, and then thus how we were able to envision and imagine change happening across our movement spaces. And so the fire that fuels for me is important, as it helps us figure out how do we pull on that passion that drives us forward in the movement to fuel us and not to burn us out. I want to give Rhia just a second to introduce herself as well. And Rhia is joining us from India today.
Rhia? Thanks, Ariana. Thank you. Yeah, can you hear me? I think you should be able to hear me fine. I've been a human rights lawyer and activist.
She's definitely connected, but we're having trouble hearing you, Rhia. Try to see if maybe you are on mute.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead, and Rhia, when you join us, we'd love to hear a little bit more about you and why this work is so important to you. And I'm co-founder of Rhiza Collective, and Rhia is one of our incredible research fellows. So before we start, I just want to thank all of you for being here first. There are over 500 people who signed up for this webinar, so I just want you to take a moment. And if you're listening live, think of the 500 other people who believe that this issue is important, who believe that we can change the way we structure our movements and the way we structure our organizations, so they fuel us, so they sustain us. I want to thank all the people who came before you in this work, the activists and leaders, your own families and cultures and communities. And I want to thank you for the work you're doing every day. And especially for being here right now, for taking the time for this real and important with all the busyness and stresses that everyone's facing.
So we're going to try this one more time. Rhia, would you mind speaking again to see if we can hear you?
Hi.
Yes, wonderful.
So yeah, I just really quickly wanted to talk about what drew me to this work. I've been a human rights lawyer and an activist for like 12 years now, and and it's sort of, especially when you're a lawyer or you're in a very structured field, you're just taught to disconnect from any emotion and you go, right? And then I sort of came across this concept of how does this work affect you, right? And then I started looking at how it affects the community of lawyers that I work with, and community of activists I work with. And similar to what Ariana said, I realized it was so deeply fractured, with a lot of conflict, in the middle of so much resilience and people who've been really in this field for 20 years and 30 years. But there's this burnout that you're experiencing and you're witnessing across all the different ages of people who are here. So I studied I worked with this incredible team at NYU looking at the concepts of resilience within a specific field within human rights, and understanding how you can reconnect with what makes this work important to you in a way that so your activism work becomes intentional and also is informed by this ethics of care towards yourself also and towards the people in your movement, and not just towards the change that you're trying to bring. And that will sort of influence the work that you're doing. So yes, I'm excited to show you all the tools that we've been building at Rhiza Collective. Yeah.
So Rhiza is an organization, a women-led collective that uses storytelling, healing, organizing, and research to support social transformation and environmental justice. And we really believe in building power from the inside out, and that's really necessary to dismantling oppression and changing our world. And so I want to start us off thinking about what makes our fire burn? What fuels it? So what makes a fire burn is space between the logs, a breathing space. Too much of a good thing, too many logs packed in too tight can douse the flames almost as surely as a pail of water would. It's a poem by Judy Brown. And to help us think that it's not only a privilege or an extra fluff to have breathing space, it's necessary for our fire to be fueled, for our fire to burn, that breathing space is what allows our work to be possible. So we're just going to take a moment now to start off with some breathing space, to start off this webinar grounding ourselves in what fuels us. And this is a practice that you can use when you are at work, when you start to feel maybe disconnected from your purpose, when you feel like you need some regeneration. So first, a few people wrote in and shared what fuels their fire. I asked you to think about an image or a moment that really distills for you why this work is important to you.
Sure. A couple of the comments that we received from the audience is the importance of singing and feeling part of a community. Also connecting with community. Another participant stated that what fuels their fire is that they believe God has called them to do the work that they do, and they trust in Him to give them the strength and energy to do it. And there are other countless examples, but I will let you continue.
So I want everyone on the call to think for a moment about what is the thing that fuels your fire. Maybe there was a specific moment when you realized this is the work you wanted to do, a person that inspired you to keep doing the work, an experience of injustice from when you were a child that you knew that you wanted to change. And distill that, think of that fuel, and think of it in one image, a concept that you can hold inside your mind. And so we're now going to hold that concept with us, that image, and we're going to do 10 breaths. And these are breaths of fire. So you're going to breathe in and out through your nose, and then kind of pull your abdomen in during the inhale and push it out during the exhale. So it's going to sound like this. Okay. So we're going to do 10 breaths together. Again, these breaths help ground us, regenerate us. And as we're doing those 10 breaths, we're gonna hold that image in our mind. And let's begin. And now hold that image. Feel grounded in your body, in your purpose, in what fuels your fire forward. Remember, you can use this practice whenever you feel like you need some regeneration or to become reconnected to what matters to you. So Fire That Fuels is a program that works to strengthen social justice groups by building a network of leaders who are really developing regenerative practices and strategies in their organizations and movements. And we do this in a couple of ways. We have trainings and toolkits, coaching networks. We do webinars and articles like this one. And we work to create public dialogue and resilient media that talks about this issue. Our work is global, so in the US we have an emerging collaboration with organizations seeking to really center these practices in their vision and strategies. In Uganda, we're working on creating a collaborative toolkit and training of trainers to support LGBTQ activists facing repression and stigma. And we're also open to collaboration with coalitions and organizations and foundations to really integrate these resources into their work. And you can find out more about how Fire That Fuels works and download some of our resources on our website. So today's agenda is meant to be a workshop space where we'll be working together on the call to work through some practices. And we really believe that these systems of oppression shape the way we relate to each other and to the world around us. And as we've said, that what really fuels our struggles for justice forward can burn us out. And so how do we work with this? How do we shift our current practices to sustain us? So we're going to pick one single practice today, and we're going to identify the change that you want to make. And then we're going to look at that in terms of how that shift can occur through the beliefs and boundaries that you need to create around it, the policies and structures in your organization that might need to shift, and the dynamics of people within your team in response to that practice. And we'll end by really reviewing that practice and how you can find people in your community who can actually support you in implementing it. So we're going to begin today by a little bit of a background on stress and resilience, and thinking about checking in with ourselves about our own levels of stress and resilience. So when we think about our movement, we're thinking about the fire that burns us out and the fire that fuels us, and how we move from being burnt out to being fueled again. So in our movements, we have generational trauma. That's trauma that's passed down from systems of oppression. There's vicarious stress and trauma, and that can be passed to us from stories that we hear from the work that we do. And then there's cumulative stress. And like you might have heard in the story that I shared, it's kind of like a grocery bag. You fill it and fill it and fill it with things you may not realize you're getting stressed until one day the bag breaks. So we want to move from generational trauma to the fire that fuels us, to reclaim our history and identity. We want to move from that vicarious stress to actually how do we come together in our collective resilience, and move from that cumulative stress, that buildup of stress, to feeling regenerated and moving towards joint action. So I want you to think for a minute, how does this stress impact you? So this is a list of some factors that contribute to high stress. And so as you're thinking about how this stress impacts you, take a minute to think of which top 2 or 3 on this list you think most contribute to your high stress levels. If there was ones not on this list, you can think of those too, but here's some that are really common in our field. Okay. And now that you've thought about which factors are affecting your stress, you want to think about where you would rate yourself in terms of your levels of anxiety and burnout. And so it's important to understand first that not all stress is bad, that we need stress, and that we want balanced stress, which is when there's a balance between our stress and the resilience and the resources we have to deal with it. What causes problems is when we have high levels of stress that can either bring us more towards high anxiety or towards burnout or towards both. So when we're experiencing more anxiety related to stress, we feel more overengaged, we're overreactive, everything feels really urgent, and our physical energy feels really depleted. Whereas when we're moving more towards burnout, we feel more disengaged, our feelings feel kind of blunted, we might feel more helpless or hopeless, and our motivation and our drive is really depleted. So just look at this spectrum for a minute and see where you might place yourself. Are you in a really good place with balanced stress in the green zone? Are you moving in some areas of the yellow zone or more into the red zone? Where in this current moment are you in terms of your levels of high anxiety or burnout?
What is the thing that we're interested in thinking about, and we invite you to think about, is the connection between what you're feeling individually and how that gets reproduced in your community and your work and your the larger structures that you work within. So when we feel fragmented, overburdened, and disconnected, our organizational cultures and the larger nonprofit and social movement work we do will reflect that. We'd actually we'd surveyed the participants who just before joining this webinar, and you know, a lot of us in this space today are feeling a lot of these things. Over 12% said that they experienced a loss of purpose. Over 12% said that they felt conflict or division in their field. And another large part said that they had difficulty balancing their work and their personal lives. People on this call represent many different areas of social justice and nonprofits. And this is an issue that deeply affects us. Like I said, I've done a lot of work within a related field, specifically human rights defenders. A 2015 global study showed, that almost 19% of the people surveyed exhibited signs of PTSD. And this is extraordinarily high. This is a rate similar to what combat veterans face. And the further 19% exhibited signs of burnout. So it's clear that this work is, it's deeply affecting a lot of the people in this field.
Thanks, Rhea. So if this work is affecting us so deeply in the field, how do we see that impact across ourselves and our organizations and our movements? One way to think about it is how our bodies automatically respond to stress. So when stress happens, a signal is sent to our brain, and we go automatically into flight, fight, freeze, or collapse or appease mode. And these are automatic reactions to stress. They're meant to protect us. So we move into these modes so we can act quickly. And what we see is that we don't just see these reactions in ourselves when we're stressed in our workplaces or in our social movements. We may find ourselves, for example, going into fight mode when we feel like someone at our organization has misunderstood us. But we also might notice our organizations going into these modes. So we might see that our organization is mired in conflict or in fight mode, or that there's constant turnover in flight mode, that people don't want to stay and manage the conditions that are there. We can even see this across our movements. If we think about mass political upheaval in this country, the Trump election represents that, and we saw freeze mode. We saw our nation as a whole and our movements not know how to move forward. So these responses to stress impact us across ourselves or organizations and our movements. And therefore, we must work at all those levels in order to undo them. So we'd like now to hear from you and understand a little more, how do you see these impacts show up across organizations and movements that you are a part of?
So we have a couple of responses now. One of our participants talks about organizational structure mentions that their organizational structure loses integrity. Someone mentions just general tension. There's somebody else mentioned high turnover rate, staff turnover, freeze, talk, and no action. Says another participant. There is no time for planning. At our organizations, we have people in the freeze mode moving into appease mode and people not showing up. And then there's also lack of trust in leadership and peers. And there's many, many more comments coming through, but these are just a few samples.
So we all see these impacts happening on multiple levels. And we know that we can't let these patterns fraction our power when globally the work we do is more necessary than ever. So Fire That Fuels is a response to that. We have principles that we believe are important to do more regenerative work in the nonprofit field, more regenerative organizing. And we believe that in order to really fuel this fire of social change, we need to have an expansive vision that ignites and spreads. We need to have regenerative practices that give us space for this work to happen. We need resilient groups that can use the friction that comes up and use the tension to be more creative and more collaborative. We need our movements to be fueled by really strong grassroots leadership and deeply rooted strategy. And that all can cause a chain reaction where movements are connecting around the globe and have a broader and more powerful vision. So these are the key principles that are part of our regenerative organizing strategy. They're at the core of Fire That Fuels. And on today's call, we'll be thinking particularly about building resilient groups and regenerative practices. And just to think about what is this goal of regeneration, it's organizing that builds on our creativity, our cultures, and our histories as resources. It respects the necessary cycles of growth and centers the joy and growth inherent in deep connection and relationship. So we're going to bring Fire That Fuels now to you. So let's figure out how you can identify the change you want to make that will help you refuel or fuel yourself forward. So right now we're going to give you a few minutes to decide what regenerative practice you think you need to implement to create a new pattern in your life, in your work, in your organization, in your movement. You listed and looked before at some of the factors that are causing high stress in your life, like heavy workloads or lack of balance. And if I think about my young activist self in the prison industry, I would say that heavy workloads were such a big factor for me. And so my practice might be something like having better boundaries about what time I would finish working at night. And here are some examples of practices to respond to different stressors. Please come up with your own, but for heavy workloads, you could think about working with coworkers to see how responsibilities can be shared, addressing conflicts by standing up for yourself, addressing issues as they come up. And these examples are actually drawn from the survey that we did prior to this with participants of ways that you were talking about these issues and how they're showing up in your work. Hearing intense stories at work, you can create breaks or implement peer support systems. So these are all examples of practices you can use to respond to different stressors. Your practice that you determine right now does not have to be very specific. We're going to work through it over the course of this call. By the end of it, your practice will be clear and defined, and you'll understand it on different levels. So right now, just think of one of the factors that impacted stress and a practice that you think would make some significant impact in shifting that. And as you're writing, a recent report came out looking at stress factors in amnesty, where there was unfortunately a suicide, and we've been seeing some high-profile cases happening across the field recently. And these were some of the key factors impacting cumulative stress that they mentioned in their report. I also want to note that we understand that thinking about what practices are most important to you is a process that takes time. And so we have a tool that we call the Regeneration Wheel that actually helps you assess all the deep parts of your identity and the priorities and values in your life, and then look at how much time and energy you've been able to have in all those different areas, and to choose which areas to prioritize and to work on. Unfortunately, we don't have time to do that on the call, but if that would help you to think more deeply about the practices you want to define moving forward, if you go to our website under Fire That Fuels, there's a link and you sign up and you can download that PDF. Okay. So now we're going to think about this practice across the different levels. And we always want to start off with the deep-rooted beliefs that shape our practice. So I want you to think for a minute, what are the beliefs underlying my existing patterns? And what are the boundaries that I need to create a new practice? And so I'm going to ask you now to grab a paper and a pen, and forgive my funny little graphic here. But you're gonna draw the outline on your piece of paper of this kind of gingerbread man, this body. And this represents us. And I'll give the example with myself. My practice, as I said earlier, for this young burned out activist that never got these resources, was that I really wanted to be able to leave work earlier at night. Yeah. And so there were a lot of messages that I had received about my work style, my work approach, about my passion and commitment to the field, that made that actually really hard to do. So for example, I had a belief that that other activists, that the young people I was working with, their families, had it worse, that those on the front line had it worse. And so I couldn't rest if they couldn't rest. That came from a message from the movement that I internalized. I was always watching the media and hearing cases at that time of a lot of abuse in juvenile detention centers. And so everything felt urgent. It felt absolutely urgent all the time. There was always a new news story. So the media was telling me it's urgent, you can't rest. I worked with some incredible colleagues. I was a young organizer. And so I thought, oh, if I leave work early, my coworkers are going to think I'm not committed to this. Yeah. So that was a message that I had internalized from the organization around me.
For perspective, and sorry to interrupt
Sure.
you, would you mind telling us what early meant for you at that moment?
Oh yeah, let's see. Like 9 p.m. was when I usually left work. So I think I was also a student organizer at the time. So 9 p.m. was when I would leave work and then go home to do the other work that I had for school. Yeah. Yeah, and then, we want to understand that systems of oppression are acting on us all the time, and that we all have different identities and experiences and values and cultures that shape who we are, and also shape the way that we experience stress. And particularly those with more marginalized identities, the intersection of different marginalized identities may face this stress even more acutely. We know that as activists, our colleagues in Uganda who we're working with are facing so much constant stigma that they don't even feel safe at night. It's hard to sleep because they don't know if they'll be attacked, and they also don't know if they're disconnected from their families and communities, right? So we have to understand also that we get messages related to all the different identities that encompass us and a part of us. One for me was also that, I have an immigrant family, that we really had to prove ourselves. So part of what a belief about my work was that, I really have to prove myself. I have to show that I can do this, and that's important for my family. Yeah, so we have all these beliefs coming into us and shaping the way we think. We also have positive ones, right? So I believed and I knew that what we were doing made a difference. I felt that we could stop the incarceration of young people in our country, and that felt important. And the young people I worked with who were shifted by that, every single day gave me hope to keep going. And those were messages I took in from the community that sustained me, that fueled my fire. So I want to give you a minute now, using the outline that you've drawn. In the center of the body, I want you to write some of the messages you received about work that reinforce your existing patterns. Yeah. So if your practice is thinking about leaving earlier, what are some of the beliefs or messages that you've gotten that make that hard? And again, you can think about beliefs you hold, or you can think about the messages you received from family, from culture, from media, from organizations. Some of them we hear and we reject, and some of them we internalize, and they become part of the way we think about ourselves. Okay. So hopefully you had a chance to write 2 or 3 messages down, or 2 or 3 beliefs that you have around that existing pattern around work. And now you're going to look and identify one belief that you want to hold on to that actually fuels you forward, and one belief that you really want to let go of, that you really feel like contributes to burning you out. So for my example, I think that if I wanted to leave work before 9 p.m., is what you get to ask, I would have had to really let go of the belief that my coworkers would think I'm not committed, that my coworkers and my boss would think that I wasn't committed to work, that they knew I was committed even if I left earlier. That showed through the way I talked about the work, the relationships I had in the community, and it wasn't a contest to see who could stay the latest, right? So I would let go of that belief, and I think it would have significantly impacted what time I was able to leave work. And I would hold on to this belief that I was making a difference. And that belief really allowed me to continue through really difficult moments and see some powerful victories in our movement. So now we're going to think of the beliefs that you let go of and the ones you held on to. And on the outside of the gingerbread man shape, we are going to write in boundaries that you need. So what boundaries will actually help you implement this practice or counter those beliefs or support the beliefs that you had? So for example, knowing that I make a difference in the lives of others, reminding myself of that belief, I would have a boundary that I would remind myself that I can rest, and that will make the movement stronger. And that actually, because I knew I was making a difference, if I said my rest will actually build a more powerful movement, and created that as an internal process for myself and also as a boundary, that would have shifted how I acted. And then if I think about my coworkers or others in my workplace thinking I'm not committed, a boundary I would have had to create would be to talk to my coworkers or talk to my boss and let them know I have to leave early, and ask them for their support in leaving before 9 o'clock p.m. So what are the boundaries that you need to create in order to make this practice possible? It could be more an emotional boundary that you create internally that shifts the thought pattern that you have, or it could be an actual conversation you need to have with someone at home, in your family, in your organization, to actually create more space for yourself.
As people are writing, can I ask a question? How hard is it when you're doing an exercise like this? And I'm actually excited to try this out after we're done here, but to be honest with yourself, right? As you're writing things down, because I think that even as you're thinking about the boundaries that you have to set, you're probably already making excuses in your mind as to why you shouldn't do that. Do you have any recommendations for how to navigate those, your own, desires to counter yourself?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's why we go back to these practices of what fuels your fire, right? And our breathing practices, because when we're grounded in our purpose, it helps remind us that actually we achieve our purpose more powerfully if we're able to create the boundaries that help us to be strong, that help us to feel sustained and regenerated. Because I think, there's a constant voice inside our head, right? Or many voices, as we've shown with this exercise, that are giving us different messages. But when you're centered in your own purpose, and when you have a belief that purpose will be possible when you are being your best, most grounded self, then it allows you to say, okay, I can really shift this. Okay, I may worry about my coworkers feeling this way, but I know that I can do better work, that our movements can do better work if I'm able to say to them, no, I have to leave early. And you raise an important point in saying that, because the reason we go and talk about not only what structures and policies need to change, but also the dynamics in your workplace, is because these are not just beliefs that we've had, they're practices and cultures that are supported around us. And so we can't just expect, okay, I'm going to leave work early now. Well, is my workload less? Or do my coworkers feel okay with me doing less work, right? There's all these shifts that need to happen across the different levels.
Right.
So you can work internally with that, and then you have to do the external work around that. Yeah. Okay. So if people have had a chance to write their boundaries, could people share what boundaries you felt you needed to put in place to implement your new practice?
Yes, we have one comment here coming in. Sophie says, turning off work cell phone on nights and weekends. I said yes because I agree with that one wholeheartedly. Another one of our participants said, no work-related communication before or after work hours or during breaks. Someone else said, boundaries, I am not my thoughts or mind chatter. Oh, that's interesting. For loss of purpose, making a digital wall of reminders from my constituents to show that it really does make a difference. That's a great one. This is a good one. I don't keep work email on my cell phone for that reason. Someone else said, sharing workload responsibilities with management. I do not have to take on all the work myself. We are better as a team. It's great. Someone is actually inviting you to Staten Island, and they're asking who they can reach out to. So we will pass along that message to you.
Excellent, excellent. And we'll have all our information at the end. And we'd love to have you be part of this community working on Fire That Fuels with us.
Absolutely. Someone else said, especially since we work in deeply personal missions, boundaries between our work self and our life self can be hard. That is very true. We're getting a lot of comments around just committing to keeping to work hours. And then also just really, a lot of comments about making sure that your work is really teamwork. And that you are reaching out to coworkers to contribute and to help out when necessary. Yeah, so there's a lot of great comments coming through. Thank you so much, everyone, for contributing.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And thank you, everyone. So I think people raised some really important points. Some were internal boundaries that they're creating, and some are external, right? And so we want to take it to the next level now. So we talked about the air, the oxygen, the space we need to create. And now we're into this fuel. So what are the policies and structures in your workplace that reinforce your existing patterns? And what would you need to change to better enable you to implement a new practice? So if people said things like turning off work cell phones or not getting work email on the phone, that has to be something that the organization agrees to when hours are that email is checked. Or if someone else talked about teamwork, there has to be a value around managing conflict and having space for problems to be resolved in the organization. So we're going to explore again. We're leading you through a very quick process. This work is much, much deeper, and we'd love to collaborate with folks to do some of the deeper work. But we're going to lead you through a very quick assessment of your own organization to think about some of these areas where you can become more regenerative. So we have an assessment and prioritization tool we call COPE. COPE stands for Connected, Communicative, Celebrating Success. That's the C. O, Organized Time and Workflow. P, Process for Shared Decision Making and Problem Solving. And E, Establishing Clear Roles and Shared Vision. So what we're going to do, again, this is not the answers, but these are to help you assess which areas your organization will need to work on. And so I'm going to read each of these 4 letters in COPE. And as I read it, I'm going to ask you to rank your organization or your movement space or your collective from 1 to 5 in each of these areas. 1 is the lowest, 5 is the highest. And again, this is a tool that we use with organizations. We actually do it live so that everyone in the organization is in the room, and then we move around the room based on the ranking, and then people have conversations about why they assess them there, and then through that dialogue, a lot comes out about things that might have been hidden, places where people felt not heard, not understood, that allows people to create kind of a powerful assessment together. So, we can talk more. You can use this tool in your own organization, but for right now, you are going to do the ranking. So C stands for Connected, Communicative, Celebrating Success. Under C, we have support systems for each other in the organization when stress comes. The organization is willing and able to communicate around challenges that arise. The organization takes time to appreciate the work of everyone in it, celebrate victories, and have policies and practices around taking real breaks. And the organization honors different identities and experiences, including putting those of different identities into leadership positions and honoring the value that they bring to the organization. So that is C. O is organized time and workflow. So the organization or group isn't spread in too many directions and isn't trying to do everything at once. It has resources, financial, emotional, etc., to support existing staff and effective team processes that enable a clear focus on priorities. Under O also is managing overload and overburdening of staff and reasonable workload expectations. And finally, under O, workflows that allow space to manage trauma, deal with difficult situations. There's debrief, check-ins, and limited exposure to traumatic content. And there's more, obviously, under each of these, just to give some ideas. P is for processes for shared decision-making and problem solving. So is the organization able to find common goals when moving through crises or transition? Do people feel supported in those processes? Is there transparent communication that happens at different levels of the organization where people can share those needs and those needs are adequately responded to? Are people able to have a place to address concerns and for actual shifts to happen when those are raised, not just for them to be vocalized, but to feel like there's a process for real change? And finally, E, establishing clear roles and shared visions. So in this role, different team member strengths and resources are cultivated, and there's a culture of continuous support and improvement. There's a sense of shared purpose and vision that really guides the organization, and everyone knows how we fit together in that vision. And each team member has real clarity about their roles and expectations and how they contribute towards that vision, and is not, again, trying to do everything for everyone all the time. So those are some examples of COPE. So hopefully in listening to those, we'll give you one more minute. You're able to rank your organization from 1 to 5 in each of those areas.
So when we say 1 is low and 5 is high, what does that mean exactly? Just for
So 1 is that your organization is not doing those things very well. So for example, people are don't have systems of support. There's not clear and transparent processes of communication. Their work isn't celebrated. Or if it's a 5, a high, and a P area, maybe there's really powerful processes for shared decision making. There's change processes through the organization. Conflicts are resolved.
We're getting some interesting comments here from our participants. Just while people have time to finish their rating, somebody asked, actually, I think this is an interesting question, is when there's too much information or too much communication, it's almost to a fault. Mm-hmm. How would you rate that? Would that still be a 1, or would that be a 4 or a 5?
Yeah. Well, it sounds like if the impact of that too much communication is that people feel overwhelmed, mm-hmm. then I would rate that low.
Okay.
Because an overly transparent system of communication turns into overload, mm-hmm. And then that causes much more stress. Mm-hmm. So yeah. Great. So now we're going to go to part 2 of this, which is thinking of your own practice. Again, my example was about leaving work earlier at night. Where does your practice fit within COPE? Because this is your area you're going to think about. This is the structures and policies that I need to focus on shifting in my organization if I really want to fully implement this practice. So for me, that fell under O, organized time and workflow. Again, many of us might feel this way working for scrappy, amazing grassroots organizations with really limited time and resources and staff. We were just doing too many things all the time because we were responding to so many needs that felt really, really, really urgent. And so that ended up, our passion ended up us all working very, 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 very late hours. So we needed those structures in place that would allow our workflow to be more grounded. And also we were working in and out of families facing incarceration and seeing kids locked up over years can have a deep impact on you and your view of the world. And we did not have workflows that were organized for taking breaks after we had heard a lot of traumatic stories. We didn't have processes in place for us to debrief those things. So I would say O and maybe a little bit of P as well. So again, look at the COPE assessment and figure out which category your practice fits within. Again, this isn't comprehensive, so if it doesn't fit in one of those, you can make up one of your own categories. And finally, you can think of this in a couple ways. Again, this is just a prioritizing and assessment tool, but if you want to actually come out of this webinar and go to your organization and say, hey, I think these are some things we should address. If you look at your ranking, where is your organization ranked the lowest? Is that where you would start to shift practices? Or because your practice fits within one of those letters, is that the area you would want to start to shift things in your organization? So just to think, if I want to start to change the culture of my organization, what is the priority area where we should be working? Okay, so we've thought now about our beliefs and our boundaries, about structures and policies, and we're moving on to dynamics. So it's an organization is not just the structures and policies in place, it's our team members, it's our bosses, it's all the people we're working with all the time. And the dynamics around care, around these processes in our organization. So we call this the friction part, right? And you need friction to start a fire. And we believe that these interactions actually can help organizations to be more creative and more innovative if people know how to channel them. So we want you to think about what are the responses to stress and overall dynamics currently at play in your organization or movement space. How might your responses and your coworkers impact how you implement your new practices? And so we're going to go over, in the next slide, some of the responses to stress that we discussed earlier when we talked about fight, flight, freeze, or appease. So hold this question and you start thinking about what's the culture of my organization actually look like? So there are 4 types of automatic responses: fight, flight, freeze, or appease. And I'm going to read them each to you. And as I read them to you, I'm going to have you think about which response best matches how you respond to stress and conflict in your workplace or your movement. So those who are in fight mode, they want to confront the situation. When a problem happens, they'll be the first people who want to talk about it. They feel a strong urgency to address it in the moment. They want to dialogue about it. Fight does not mean that you're fighting someone. It means that you want to dialogue, you want to address it directly, you want to confront it head on. Flight means that when stress happens, you want to feel like you need to remove yourself physically or emotionally from the situation. So you need to step away for a moment in order to process, to take in, and then you can come back. But instead of moving in like fight mode, flight people need to remove themselves to step away. They withdraw more when high stress is coming or when conflict comes. Freeze. So in freeze mode, you feel really initially overwhelmed and it's hard to react. So when you face a lot of stress, it's overload on you. Your mind just kind of gets stuck. How do I respond? And it's hard to know what to do. And finally, this is called collapse or appease mode. So in appease mode, you're trying to take responsibility. You're trying to take it on yourself. So an appeaser is going to say, it's my fault, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. When faced with conflict or when facing stress, they take more and more and more of it on themselves. So these are 4 automatic responses to stress and burnout. We all do all of them at different times. But what we find is that people have a tendency, a conditioned way that they respond to stress over time. And we know that sometimes those are different in our workplaces and in our family environments. So I will give the example of my partner. At home, I'm much more of a confronter, a fighter, and they're much more of a flighter. So you can imagine that when they're stressed, they leave, and when I'm stressed, I'm reactive and I want to talk about things. And when we actually have a conflict, I want to sit down and dialogue about it right at that moment, and they're out the door. So these are our automatic responses, right? None of them are good or bad. They're just how we respond, and we're conditioned to respond over time. Now that we might exemplify certain things at home, in our home environment, that are different than in our workplace. And we tend to have a general way that we respond to conditions in our workplace as one of these 4 types. Again, we might sometimes be more in fight mode, we might sometimes be more in flight mode, but we generally respond in a certain way. So I will say in my organization that I'm generally appeased, and when a problem comes up, I always want to take it on. It's my fault. I can do it. I can manage it. I can fix it, which leads to like the overload that I talked about facing earlier, right? This is my response to stress. I can take it. I can take it. So we want you to think for a minute, again, about which response best matches you, how you respond and react under stress and conflict in your workplace specifically, or in your movement. And then I'd like you to to think a little bit about which best describes your team, especially those who will be impacted by you implementing your practice. So, we do this exercise actually with really big groups, and it's really interesting because you will see teams in the room, people separate out based on the groups and talk about what communication styles they prefer based on their stress response and how they can best be supported by others. And what you find is often a certain team will have one response. So there'll be a team that's more in a flight mode and doesn't really want to confront the problems. And then there's another team that's more in fight mode, let's say, and they always are going at each other, right? Or across organizations, sometimes teams have mixed personalities, and you can see how that leads to more stress or conflict in their dynamics. So it's important to know as you think about your practice, if I'm going to shift conditions with people around me, on my team or my boss, what kind of responses to stress will they have? What kind of reactions can I expect from them? And what might I expect in myself? So if I'm someone who goes into flight, if I actually have to set this boundary and talk to my coworkers, that might be challenging for me. I might not want to confront it. Or if I go into fight mode, I may want to confront it, but I may kind of be strong in a way that others might not be able to take in, right? So it helps you to think about how will you talk to others about your practice, and how might they respond, and how are they generally responding to the stress in the organization. And if you want to chat to us just for a second, what's your response to stress? How do you think this can help you manage relationships and dynamics in your workplace? And go ahead and write in.
Yeah, so feel free to share your responses via our chat, and I will gladly pass these along to Ariana and Ria. We have a couple of comments already coming in. One of our participants says that they either freeze or they fight. It really depends on the situation and how much coffee they've had. Another person said they like to confront their situation, so they're more of a fighter, but in a calm manner. They try to do it in a calm manner. So another person says that their chairperson is more of a fighter, and they are more of a flight. They prefer to take time to think about things. So they counterbalance each other in a nice way. Someone else said they actually started out by fighting, and now they're just appeasing everyone. Someone else says, I remove myself, but I'm not sure how it helps. So there's definitely a lot of, I think there's like a good mix of a good balance of like flight and fight. I feel like most of what we're getting is either that they're fighters, or that they like to kind of remove themselves from the situation. Someone is commenting that the whole response of appeasing is something that is very new to them. They were not aware of that. Someone said being honest is the way that they cope with stress. I'm wondering if that's a way of confronting, if that's a way of confronting or being somewhat of a quote unquote fighter, right?
Exactly.
But as you were saying, like not necessarily in a violent way, but just simply by being honest.
None of these are, again, these are all our natural responses, and we're not talking about someone who's like directly confrontational, yelling at people. It's just a willingness to kind of lean in more and to address it, or a tendency to kind of need to step back and take more space, or to take it on yourself. Yeah. So being really honest is more of a confronting. You're moving in directly. You're telling people how you feel and why you feel that way.
One of our participants has a very interesting comment. They said, I recognize that many sincere folk consider confrontation as conflict, which is perceived as abuse. I understand now that establishing safety is important and should be something that's ongoing. That's a very interesting observation.
Yeah, I'll just say, and we can move on, but I'll just say that one of the interesting things about when we see this exercise happen, or the way that we use it, is we have organizations dialogue with each other about, based on my way of communicating or my response to stress, how do I need support from you, and how do I need to be communicated with, and what do you do that maybe drives me a little crazy? And it can really help people better understand each other's motivation. So someone actually being able to confront something is really help. You want someone on your team who's going to be the one to move in directly. But that can be really hard for someone who goes more into flight mode. They can feel very overwhelmed. So if those two people on the team better understand each other's responses, then they can say, oh, the flight person needs 5 minutes, but then I can come in and I can understand how confronting this and talking about it directly with you will be helpful. So I think it's part of this tool is to have some better understanding to improve our communication and to actually use conflict constructively and stress and tension. Because as we said in the beginning, we need some stress. We just need it to be balanced.
Yeah. No, I love that.
So I want to, I know we want to get to some time for questions. So I'm going to have Ria move us into our final practice. We call it 1, 2, 3, ABC, easy as 1, 2, 3. And this is a way to kind of summarize your practice for today. And the reason we end with this is we have, from doing all these workshops, recognized that what makes people successful in actually creating regenerative practices that fuel their fire is having the support people to actually hold them accountable for doing it, and having ways that integrating this, reminding themselves to do this, is integrated into their life. So Ria's going to share.
You're on, Ria.
Yeah. So, like it said, it's as easy as 1, 2, 3. So we start with, what is your practice? In one sentence. So just try and make it as specific as possible. This, could take a bit of work to refine it down to, one sentence. But it's worth that work, because the clearer your idea is, more clarity you have, the more impetus you have to move towards, doing that practice. Um, and then, you sort of think about two people who can help you to be accountable at that practice. And that's really, really important, to have people who can call you into, what your own vision for yourself is, somebody, an outsider who you trust, who can remind you, okay, this is what you promised yourself, and this is what what you want to do. And it's helpful if you split, where these people are based. One maybe in your work context, and one at home or in your community, in your larger community. And finally, what are the 3 reminders you will create to maintain that practice? So I liked the idea that somebody had written in with, about creating, like I think it was a digital kind of like a mood board to remind you why you're doing this. So something like that, maybe, that'll really remind you of, okay, this is something that I told myself I'm going to do. So I invite you to think about also, what these reminders could look like, how you could integrate them into your day to sort of bring you back to that practice that you promised yourself you would do. Yeah, and I'm going to pass it over to Ariana to talk a little bit about Rhiza Collective.
Yeah, and those reminders are really important. Many of us live in a digital world. We have cell phones that we can set alarms for to remind us what times we're supposed to leave. We can have notes up. We can have actual people calling us at 7 p.m. to say, hey, get out of the office. But creating actual real reminders will help increase your accountability to actually shifting a practice. Thanks so much, Ria. So we're just going to end before getting to questions with telling you a little more about Rhiza. Shout out to Staten Island. We'll come to you. There's lots of ways to be involved with the Rhiza Collective and also with the Fire That Fuels project. So for Fire That Fuels, we're definitely looking for partnerships with US-based movements who want to think about this regenerative organizing and really taking this work on. We also work with folks to do assessments and coaching for your organization or your foundation and help you think through how to implement or integrate. We're building a network of leaders who care about these issues, who think we can transform our movement spaces. And so you can become part of that network, become an FTF leader, get training, bring these practices back. And also we love working with different movements and spaces. We work in labor, environmental justice, immigration, but we know that the needs of all those spaces and movements are sometimes really different. So we'd love to have people's feedback to help develop and adapt toolkits and resources based on what needs you have. Also, as we've all talked about, there's more than 500 people who signed up for this webinar. So we need to create dialogue and media on why regenerative organizing is necessary. We need to be talking about it. We need to shift the cultures of silence in our organizations and our movements around these issues. So use the platforms you have to share these issues, share Fire That Fuels, share your own vision of how this work is possible. And if you can, spread the word about Fire That Fuels. This is our website and our Facebook, and it says a little more about what we do. And again, there's some resources that you can download on there to get more info. So thank you so much for being with us. We're looking forward to questions.
Thank you so much, Ariana and Ria. We really appreciate this, and I love this framework that you have presented for us, and I'm excited to dive into it and see how we can apply it here at our own work. We're now going to begin answering the questions submitted during today's presentation. And as a reminder, you can still submit questions through the questions pane in your attendee control panel. We do appreciate your patience as we wrapped up the conversation. We will have about another 15 minutes for Q&A. So we encourage you to send us your questions right away so that we have time to respond to them. And Ariana, our first question is from Yesenia, and she says that she feels that it is expected to go above and beyond every day, even though there are deadlines given for a reason. How can I break that barrier of thinking? And as our presenters consider their response, I'd like to make you aware of 2 special opportunities. This live online training is part of our All Together Now Conversations in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion series. So we do ask you to join us on April 9th to discuss how foundations and nonprofits alike often struggle to communicate effectively about the importance of racial equity in their work. You will be able to learn best practices and new approaches proven to advance equity across issues and communities in our training, Shifting the Narrative to Advance Racial Equity. Also, learn how to foster inclusion and collaboration with our self-paced e-learning course, Diversity and Inclusion, Walking the Talk. Explore strategies that advance racial equity and inclusion in foundations and their partners, and gain the ability to foster reflection and shift from reactive problem solving to co-creating proactive solutions. My colleague Elizabeth will be sharing the links to these through our chat button so that you can have access to them, and we hope that you will be able to join us on April 9th. With that, I would like to return to our question from Yesenia. Ariana or Ria, what are your thoughts on the question?
Sure, Yesenia, thanks. That's a really great question. And I think one of the ways that it can help us break a barrier internally is to get the thoughts outside of us. Because once we think we are the thoughts, it's really hard to do anything differently, right? Call it externalizing. So I think this idea of I have to go above and beyond, right? If you did the little gingerbread man exercise, gingerbread person, I should say, you know that those messages that I have to always do more, there's expectations, have come from lots of different places. Maybe it's real pressures from your organization. Maybe it's your own values and expectations that you grew up with from your family or your community. And so those are hard to shift. That's absolutely true. And one of the things that I would suggest is if you can start to become more aware of it, you can start to shift it. So first, I would maybe make a list of like, when you're thinking I have to go above and beyond, what are the main thoughts that pop up for you around that? So maybe it's like, just a little bit more and then it will be perfect, or I have to get this just right, or someone's gonna be mad at me if this isn't at the level that it should be, right? So start to figure out what are the thoughts I have, and then if you can, start to write them out when you're actually having them, and having them in front of you is gonna get them outside of your head and onto a piece of paper, and then you can practice the breathing exercise we did. You can look at one of your support people and ask for some help around this practice, but take a breath or ask for some support, and then really say, okay, do I want to move beyond this thinking? Is it really that this has to be perfect or not? Is it really that I have to go above and beyond? And writing those thoughts out should help you create some space from them. And if those pressures and deadlines are actually coming from outside, then that's an external conversation that also needs to happen to support that. So it is going to coworkers and having what we call in another one of our practices a courageous conversation, where we talk about how do you sit with yourself and sit with the other person and really talk about kind of what you need honestly. But my guess is that there's a lot of other people at your organization who feel the same way you do. And so reaching out to peers for support in this and figuring out how to have that conversation together can be really helpful. Ria, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I really liked how you put it, Ariana. I mean, one of the things that I've found helpful is to try and look at yourself as if you were a friend, you know, and that could be a helpful way to understand the pressures that you're putting on yourself. You know, to really sort of step away and say, is this like this work product that you've done? You know, is it really good? Enough? Like, did you move on and move on to the next task? You know, what is that? You know, like what kind of perfectionism are you chasing? Because it's easy again to get, like Ariana said, locked into how you're seeing something, and so it's really important to kind of step away from your own internal thought processes and see what comes. You know, all of that. That's all the things that are contributing to it, and also trying to see it from an external perspective.
Great, thank you so much for that. Our next question is from Alexis, and they ask, where does the fourth option of appease originate? I know freeze was added to fight flight, but appease is new to me. to you.
Oh, great. Yeah, thanks for asking that. So in trauma theory, and when we look at stress responses, again, these are like our animalistic responses. It's often called collapse. So if you think about, let's say, just to visualize this for a minute, a bear comes in the room and there's a little bunny. So the bunny is either going to decide to fight the bear, probably not a good idea. The bunny is either going to run away, probably what he's going to do because he's pretty fast. The bunny might freeze and get really scared and not be able to move at all, or the bunny will put its legs up in the air and pretend like it's dead, basically collapse. And so obviously we don't, in our conflict settings, generally collapse on the floor with our feet in the air, but we do tend to do an emotional version of that, where we communicate by saying, "Oh, I'm sorry." That's basically what you're doing. That you're appeasing. You're saying, "It's my fault. It's okay. You're the more powerful one. I didn't mean to do that," right? And so that's kind of where that thinking comes from. Yeah.
Great. Our next question is from Nancy, and she's asking, how do you implement this, the framework and practice that you just presented, Ariana, or how can you introduce it when leadership is not in the field and maybe they don't really understand the dynamics of what goes on in the field? They simply see themselves as managers, or maybe they don't have any interest in ending toxic attitudes and behaviors within the agency or the organization.
Yeah, I think that is why Fire That Fuels is like a deep process we often walk through organizations with and movements with, because shifting, when there isn't support on the top, it's hard to make any kind of organizational shift, especially around these issues. I mean, one thing that can be very helpful is if you or an outside organization can do some type of assessment, because, I mean, we just did the survey of maybe 100 people responded a few months ago to think about this webinar, and we came up with these pretty powerful evidence that many of you are feeling overworked, feeling a loss of purpose, are feeling that you can't balance your work and your life. And so doing some kind of assessment in the organization helps the organization really recognize that this is really, really a problem. I think sadly, we've seen enough cases in the news recently that show that even at the kind of most high-level organizations, they're experiencing this on a pretty big level. And it isn't, unfortunately, sometimes till a tragedy happens that people really, really pay attention. But we believe, and we've seen it, that there are champions, Fire That Fuels champions and leaders and organizations that are able to have those conversations, that are able to convene dialogues around it, that are able to demonstrate why this is important. And also to show management, there's examples of organizations like Human Rights Watch and other groups that are going through these processes now in order to shift from the top down because they've realized it's essential to the field. So yeah, I think it's absolutely possible to make those shifts. I mean, in the worst case scenarios, if the very top doesn't shift, we do a lot of work with organizations in creating peer support processes. So helping people figure out, okay, on my team or among my peers, what are kind of the problem-solving methods we can use to help each other solve our problems? How do we have conversations about workloads? And so to build up a base of peers who values that, even if the management on the top doesn't. So yeah, I mean, you can always appeal to them. We know that people who are feeling more grounded and supported and cared for are able to work more deeply and meaningfully. That's just true. So I'm sure you're doing incredible work, and I hope we can always connect more about how to best support that process.
Thank you, Ariana. We have a great question from Michael here. He's asking, how do we build communities of practice that are liberated from the notion of this kind of balance we're reaching for is just another task, project, or campaign that we will define eventually as a success or failure? In other words, he's saying, how can we take ourselves from this binary success versus failure mindset, especially when the work that we're doing is very complex?
Yeah, I love that. Ria, did you want to answer that first, or do you want me to go?
You can go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I think we base and ground our work in moving past oppressive systems. And so binaries, as we know, are a major form of oppression around many aspects of our identity and our work. And one of the things that, is very clear, that's why we have the C in COPE, is that celebrating and defining success in different ways, it helps us actually sustain our movements more powerfully. When you think about my work in the Burma movement, they were struggling against dictatorship for like 60 years. So it's a long struggle. And in the end, even within that movement, they didn't ultimately release dictatorship, although they had a shift. And what was important along the way in that movement was that small shifts were seen as powerful seeds that were being planted towards longer term change. So I think one of the oppressive systems is our capitalist system we live under, which has a lot of strong binaries about success and failure, right? But if we think of metaphors that are much more related to nature and earth, our movements and the nonprofit sector is a lot more like a forest where we're planting trees, where we're planting seeds that may take 5, 10, 15, 20 years to grow, where certain parts of our movements will die and shift, and new things and new growth are really, really possible. So I think it takes kind of a reframing of how we think about our work as cycles of regeneration, which is why we call it regenerative organizing, and about planting seeds for long-term change. And you can create practices where you are celebrating the successes that you see along the way. You and your peers, if not from the top of your organization, can look at how have the people been transformed, even if we didn't get that win. What story shows the transformation someone went through internally because of the work that we did around racial justice, for example, or how can we see, even if there's still police killings and police brutality issues, how can we see that we as a community are stronger and more resilient and more able to respond when those things happen, and able to heal faster, and able to invent and think of new ways of being safe with each other. So we may not have achieved the end purpose, but we have achieved so much more power along the way.
That's great. Thank you. The next question is from your namesake, Ariana, and she's asking, how do you handle coworkers who text you after hours? Especially when they text you about certain discomforts that they're having personally with you, right? Mm-hmm. How do you handle something like that? In her case, she's talking about a coworker who sent her a very long text message telling her that she's combative and controlling, and it stresses the coworker out. Do you have any suggestions for her?
Yeah, I think we know that creating boundaries is really challenging. That's why we do this practice around understanding the beliefs and understanding the structures, because it's easy to say, hey, go turn your phone off at this time or something like that. But it's really hard to do because of the real expectations around it from the outside and the real beliefs you have around it from the inside. So I would say in a situation like this, there's some assessment, right? So what is the policy in the organization around when we have to answer or respond to texts? And is there some shift that needs to be made around that? So there's some understanding that we won't take text after 7 o'clock at night, or just saying to someone, hey, I'm sorry, I don't take tests after 7. I'm happy to respond to this first thing in the morning when I get into the office, right? And so people get used to, once you are consistent with a boundary, accepting it and reinforcing it. So that's one thing, is knowing the organizational policy, and then when you set the boundary, being consistent with it, and obviously like courteous and clear about it, and making sure you're still attending to that need. I think in a situation like this, it calls for a courageous conversation, it sounds like. Maybe this person is a fighter in the fight mode, and maybe there's some underlying tension and conflict, and I can understand how Ariana is saying, if I don't respond to this text, it might fuel this person's anger or or problems that they have with me. And so finding a way to respond, I think, to say, hey, it seems like this is a really important issue, and I really want us to be able to work well together. I think we should talk in person or find a way to dialogue about this where we can both really hear each other. And knowing the intent is to move towards resolution, and stating that in a text so you're not being reactionary, right? You're not stuck in that stress reaction mode, that would keep you from being able to really meaningfully understand each other.
Right. Thank you. And I know we're out of time. We do have one more question, but for those of you that have joined us today, thank you so much. Rest assured that you will receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours with a link to view a recording of today's webinar, as well as a short survey. And we would very much appreciate your feedback, as it will help us plan future offerings, as well as consider how we can craft the best webinar experience possible. On behalf of Candid, of our presenters, we do thank you for joining us today. If you like this webinar, we hope that you join us again soon. And for those of you that do need to step away now, thank you for joining us. If you can stay a little longer, we have a couple more questions. If that's okay with you. Yeah. It's just such a fascinating topic. Nina is asking, when is it time to move on? When do you decide that the stress and burnout is just too great and that you're just no longer helping yourself or your organization?
That's a really good question, and I would guess that all of us would answer it really differently, based on different factors in our life. Are there financial issues people are thinking about? Are there relationships in the workplace that feel really, really important not to lose? I think probably, Nina, that there's a lot of different factors to think about when you're thinking about making a choice to leave or not. I will say, in one really toxic work environment I worked in, because I go into appease mode, my process was I had to wait till things got really, really bad in order to leave. Because what my response to stress is just to take it on and I'll fix it. This is my problem. I'm the one. So I think it's helpful to maybe do some reflection with yourself. And I would suggest talking to some peers who you value, maybe not in the workplace, but who know you and particularly know what drives you, what fuels your fire, and what your passion is. And to really ask yourself, is this supporting me, and is this supporting my movement? And if, as you do some reflection with them, you look at, okay, based on my stress style, how might that be impacting how I'm able to make this decision, right? Am I waiting till things get really bad, or am I leaving too soon? Like, understanding that might help you make some assessment. Understanding, again, the connection with your value and your purpose and what you believe will make change in the world. And then I think the last factor is, like, if you feel like the organization needs to shift, how open might it be? And that could be another assessment point for you, or a reflection point for you. So if this is a big problem, but I think my organization could shift it, maybe I'm willing to stay in longer and see what that process looks like. And if it's no, the organization won't shift, then maybe that helps you make that decision.
Thank you. And just to end, we have a comment here from Julie, who just thanks you for the webinar. And she says that she wished she would have had this a year ago, when she was trying to address the emerging oppression at her former organization. Through this webinar, she feels that she was able to do some internal debriefing of her experience and to continue on her personal healing journey. So she says, thank you for that. Thank you. And that's all we have. That's all we have time for today, everyone. Thank you again to Ariana and to Ria for joining us and for leading us through this great exercise. We really appreciate it. And thank you, everyone, for attending today's webinar. Again, we hope that you will join us for April 9th. More details on that in the chat. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.